Last time we moved, my family and I, a few years ago, we pretty quickly, as we were getting going, pretty quickly figured out that we needed some help. It was the middle of the week, so anyone that we thought could help us move, they were working or in school, so we hired some movers. And we had these two guys show up, and they worked hard, and listen, and if you can afford to hire some movers, there's probably not a better way to spend your money, I'm going to be honest with you. But, we moved down here then to Grand Prairie, and we were moving into a house here. I was coming to work here at Cross Point, and a bunch of people showed up to help. We had a storage unit also to help unload the storage unit, pack that truck, unload some trucks here. They went so far to, put some beds together. A bunch of people. I had to do more that day than when I hired people, I'll be honest with you, but it was great. Here's the thing. One of the most insidious things about money is that it has the ability to disconnect us. We are designed to rely on one another. And like being able to afford movers versus having your friends come and help, we are designed to lean on each other and rely on one another. And sometimes money has this way of disconnecting us from those around us, from the people that we should come to rely on, which is one another. So if you have your Bible, turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 6. We're going to finish up our series on generosity today. While you turn over there, I want to say welcome again. My name is Cale Courtwright, the preaching minister here. This is one of my favorite Sundays because as you can see here, there's a bunch of Thanksgiving bags here. I know there are some already in the audience. People are ready to go deliver these bags. This is one of the clearest ways that we love others like Jesus is on a day like today where we take these and we go and bless somebody else with them. I do want to stop for a minute though, and I want to thank Jan Henriksen. I don't know if she's in here or not, but could you help me thank Jan for all her work? This project does not get done. This is 140 bags. It might be something like 500 people that are going to be blessed by this. It doesn't get done without all of us, but it really doesn't get done without Jan. She spends a lot of time, puts a lot of work into this, so we are so thankful for her and her team, for you, for delivering this. And I will tell you, I love this Sunday because we know who doesn't show up to church. It's great. Also, as you heard earlier, we were at the family retreat last week, and I am so thankful for whenever I can be gone, for having someone like Javier who can fill in. Thank you, Javier, for doing a great job, for filling in. And as he mentioned last week, we're finishing the series on giving, and last week he called me brave. Some have said foolish. I don't know, but one or the other. We're finishing up this series on generosity. We've kind of anchored ourselves in when Jesus said, be careful where you put your treasure, because where your treasure is, there your heart will be. And we talked about just how we can so easily fall into the temptation of greed and be thinking about ourselves and building bigger barns, things like that. And one of the things that Javier reminded us of last week is we give in response to a God who has given us everything. He held nothing back from us. And so when we give, we become like him. And so we want to lean into that today. This is a verse you probably read before, but let's start in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6. Godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into the temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So you have heard this text before. You've even probably heard this mentioned in culture before, movies and TV. You've heard it. You've probably said it. Money is the root of evil. Money is the root of all kinds of evil. That's what you've heard before. Money is the root of evil. That's not what the text says, but that is what you've heard before. It's not that money is the root of evil. Money, as we've said in this series before, money is not good or bad. But it's the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. And Paul here is going to go on for Timothy. We're not going to read this part, but he's going to go on and mention all these things that Timothy could fall into. And he's saying the love of money is the root of all of that kind of evil. What are you pursuing? is another way to put it. What are you chasing after? And what he's going to say here is that we need to learn contentment. We need to learn to be content with what God has given us. And so this is not necessarily today, it's not necessarily a sermon about money, it's about something else. But what I want to say today, as we kind of jump in a little bit further, is I know we can be so easily distracted. I want to ask for the next few minutes that your mind and body and spirit are just here in this place. Every Sunday is important, but I'm going to say some things in a minute that if you miss here, you're going to get the wrong thing from it. So be here in this place. This is a verse about contentment. So a few years ago, I was training for a race. I decided I want to run a half marathon. It was about 10 years ago. I don't think since I finished, but since then till this day, I don't think I've run 13 miles combined since then. But in this time in my life, I was training to do that, and we were living in Plano at the time, and there was this park, and there's this route that I really liked to run in that time. And in the middle of the park, you could get to where all you could see were trees and grass and stuff. You couldn't see any apartments or houses or see any roads, and it was right in the middle of Plano. It was awesome. The problem was that it got cold and rainy during my training time, so at some point I had to go inside on the treadmill. And if you run 1 minute or an hour, the treadmill looks the exact same. Nothing changes. You run 1 mile or you run a marathon, you run 2 marathons, nothing ever changes. And it gets quite boring. And it gets quite taxing on your spirit in some ways in that time. Here's the deal. Paul is encouraging us to be content with what we have. The alternative is to jump on the treadmill of more and more that money would have you jump onto. And the problem is that if you jump onto that, you can never jump off. You will never get to where you're going because it doesn't go anywhere. As soon as you finally learn to get a little bit content, you get what you want, all you'll do is you'll look up and you'll see something else that you want. Money has this way of never letting us be content or at peace. You'll never get the fulfillment that you're finding. In fact, if you look around in our culture, the people who are richest in our society, I think it wouldn't take very long for you to look around and realize they don't seem very fulfilled, do they? And church, the truth is that if they, with all of their resources, all that they have at their fingertips, if money is not bringing them fulfillment, it's not going to bring you fulfillment either. And if we're not careful, we're going to jump on that treadmill and try to get to the amount of money or the stuff, the new and the more, that will never let us be fulfilled. It's not that Apple tells me to do this, but I'm fine with my phone all the time until they release a new phone. And then I look at what I have and I went, no, this is garbage now. Because now there's a new one, and I want the new one. You know what I'm saying? I'm sure it's true for you Android users as well. Paul is telling Timothy here, you need to flee from that kind of thinking. You need to flee and run away from that and pursue instead righteousness and contentment. Ultimately, what Paul is trying to teach Timothy, what he's asking him, is where do you put your hope? I think that's the question for us today. Where do you put your hope? What sustains you? What's going to give you the assurance you are looking for? And he's going to answer that question, and he's going to sum up this thought in verse 17. Paul says this, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. See, far too often, what we think is that the money and the stuff that it provides, that's the life that I'm looking for. And Paul reminds us, you need to throw that off and take hold of the life that is truly life, that can only be found in Jesus Christ. And I asked you this 2 weeks ago, and I want to ask you again today. Imagine with me for a moment somebody who is rich. If I say, imagine someone who is rich in your mind, my guess is that most people in here, even though you heard this 2 weeks ago, did not just think of themselves. we almost always think about somebody else when we think about someone who's rich. We think about someone else, we think about their house, we think about their car, we think about their job, we know about what it might make, but we don't think about us. See, we're never rich. I have a friend who's rich. I know someone else who's rich. I'm not rich. And it can allow us to kind of be off the hook, so to speak, for things like this. Now, church, globally speaking, you are very rich. You are very rich. When you take Christians around the world, even in our own country, this is a rich church. You take all the people in all the world, and you are in the 1% or even the 1 of the 1%. And so this message is for us. Command those who are rich in this present world, at this present time, not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but put your hope in God. That message is to you. You are the wealthy. And now that's really hard to think of because my guess is that you don't walk around trying not to think about yourself that way. You're not just trying to lie to yourself over and over again, but rather we just so easily fall into this trap. That's what Paul started with saying. This money is a trap in the way that it wants you to think. It's just a trap. We so too often jump on that treadmill, seeking and searching for something that's more than what we currently have. And those of us need to think about our life this way. And so you might be asking yourself instead, how do I prove to myself that this is who I am, or that I'm not putting my trust in wealth? How do I prove to myself and to God, not that He is a judge like this all the time, but how do I lean away from the wealth and that kind of thinking and into the other? Well, Paul told us this. He said, command those who are rich to do good. Now, oftentimes we can think about this the wrong way. Doing good is not just the absence of evil, especially the biblical sense. Doing good is an action. It's something that you actually do. It's positive. You bring something good to other people's life. In this case, we're talking about finances and wealth. Then he says, be rich in good deeds. You think he used the word rich on accident there? Of course not. He has a message he's trying to get across. And ultimately, to be generous and willing to share. That's what he wants for us. And he knows it's going to lead us to a life that is much better and fuller than what this world has to offer. One thing that we know is that the early church really embodied this kind of teaching and that they took this seriously. You can read in the book of Acts, but people would show up to church and they would have needs, but when they left, they would have no more needs. People would show up hungry and they would be fed. People would show up naked and they would be clothed. They would show up not being able to feed their family. They'd be poor and they would walk away with enough money to be able to feed their family. This is what the church was about. That's what Luke wrote. No one among them had any needs. No one had a need. Just 2 chapters later in Acts chapter 4, you have somebody who shows up to church. And it's as if he's taking, his nest egg, his retirement plan, the thing that's going to provide generational wealth. He has this property and he comes to church and he says, I have sold it and I'm bringing it to lay at your feet. Distribute it to those who have needs. The early church embodied this in a way that we don't often embody it. And it wasn't just the people in Acts, it was the generations after that. And we have even writings like this from the early church fathers, someone who wrote, when someone steals another's clothes, we call them a thief. Should we not give the same name to the one who could clothe the naked and does not? The bread in your cupboard belongs to the hungry. The coat unused in your closet belongs to the one who needs it. The shoes rotting in your closet belongs to the one who has no shoes. The money which you hoard up belongs to the poor. This is what it means to be part of a church family. This is what it means to take the teachings of Jesus seriously. And more than that, or to take it a step further, is to say, let me get off of this way of thinking, the world's way of thinking about our money and our finances, and lean instead into the vision, the imagination that Jesus has for you. And it's going to lead to a better life. Now, this is week 4 of this sermon series, and I am certain that when you heard that we were preaching a series on generosity and you assumed there would be something about giving, my guess is that you thought he's going to tell us how much to give. That there's going to be a time that he says, okay, look, this is the goal, you better be doing it, or else, right? Now is not that time, but that time's not coming. That was the joke. Okay, but it's more about us reframing how we think about our finances. But I will say, I was raised in a family who giving was really important. And my parents taught us to give. They told us that they didn't tell us how much they were giving, but they said we give every week because it is important to our family. And it's important how it shapes us. When I was a little bit older, they would give us a little bit of an allowance, and they made clear so much of this is supposed to be given. Well, when I was growing up, let's imagine my parents were kind of sitting over there and I was over here. It was a little bit different, but they would just be watching us in church, which served a couple of poor functions for me. But lots of conversations afterwards, including sometimes during the passing of the trays. You remember those days? They would want to make sure we would give. Now, we don't do this anymore very often, so I'm going to give you a pro tip. Here's the thing. As long as you act like you're giving, they don't know the difference. I hope they don't watch this and talk about this at Thanksgiving. Because a couple of times they would say, hey, we noticed that you didn't give today, and we know you have money to give. It was important. Even if we're talking about, a couple of quarters or $1, and it was important to have that practice. And it shaped me in some ways. So I remember getting into college, and I made some money. I worked all through college, and I honestly have no memory of whether I gave or not. I'm not just blacking it out. I don't know. I do remember thinking, and truthfully being like, I'm in college. I don't have a lot of money. Is God really asking this of me? And if I gave, it would be because, again, of how it shapes you as a person. When Savannah and I got married, I don't remember sitting down and having a conversation of do we want to give or not? We were both from, we wanted to be giving people. We didn't talk about how much or anything, but I do know this. The first Sunday after we were married, she said, I left my checkbook at home. I don't have any cash. Do you have any cash? And I went, I sure don't. And I was just hiding what I had. I had one bill that I had been saving. It was a $100 bill. And that was a lot of money back then, and still is to me today. And so I was like, she said, look, we got to give. And so she gave it. And I'm she still owes me money. But I will tell you, until being at Crosspoint, did I not get in a better habit of giving every week. And there's a little bit of a disconnect now because we give online, and I set it up, and I forget it. And so there is a little bit that's missing when you don't have the act of giving. But I will say this, it changes the conversations that we have as a family. Because I'm sure there are some people in here who give a higher percentage than we do, but for us it's significant. And the conversation that we have is that we know two things about what we want from our giving. Is that we want it to be regular, we want it to be consistent, and we want it to be at a point that there is a little bit of a cost to us. Our life would change if we didn't give. We could be more selfish than we probably already are if we didn't give at all. And so we want to give at a point that, we're paying our bills, we're making sure that our kids are fed and things like that, but we want to give in a way that has changed our life. And we give each and every week. Now, for many of you, you were probably raised in a family where you thought about and you heard the idea of tithing. And tithe is a biblical word that means 10%. And somebody in here right now is going, but that's Old Testament. And that would be true. It is mostly Old Testament. And now I will say, if you wanted to really dive into it, that they were told to give up to 3 different times a year, so much so that some of them would have been giving over 20% of their income. So let's stick into the New Testament. So they were tithing a lot. In the New Testament, we don't really get the idea of tithe as much. Now, before you think that makes it easier, it does not necessarily make it easier. So in the New Testament, what we see is that we have a lot of examples of people giving, and they give to their church leaders. And Paul even tells them to give consistently to their church leaders. And what you have then is first the apostles and then others It's just like this church, basically, is in the leaders pray and discern what God has given through the people and how God would have us to use it. You also see in the New Testament, Paul raises money to move the gospel forward. He raises money for his missionary journeys. There's also a couple times he needs to go back to Jerusalem, and he is essentially raising money to get back to Jerusalem. And then you also see most consistently all over the place, you see giving to the poor. That this was really important. In fact, in this series, we've talked about multiple examples from non-Christian sources of how they noticed how Christians would give to the poor, and how even one emperor said, we need to be more like that. They're caring for our people more than we are. Now, just to remind you about what is the New Testament principle of giving? Well, the first thing is that we just read it. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Do good, be rich in good deeds, and be generous and willing to share. This is who we are called to be. I want to remind you that this is a conversation about stewardship, which is the idea that God owns everything. Everything that we have is His, and we are merely entrusted with God's resources. And so let me be very clear about this. Even if you are giving 10%, and for you that might even be a very high income, if you are giving 10% and then going, I'm good, I checked the box, now I can spend 90% how I want, let me be very clear. That is not a biblical worldview. That is not a Christian way to think about your finances. Rather, we think about it in terms of stewardship, meaning all of this is God's, and I am called to steward it well for Him. I am called to care for, to spend, and to give my money in a way that honors Him. That's biblical stewardship. And for some of us, we're doing that better at maybe giving 5% than the person giving 10% because we're not doing it in a legalistic way. And also because we're not thinking about the rest as just ours to do with whatever we want. Again, that's not how the Bible talks about our giving. Now, for many of us in here, I don't know how many this would be, but part of the downside of thinking in terms of a tithe is that God has actually blessed you in a way to give far more than 10%. But there are some people, now I got quiet, see? Some people in here, God has blessed you so richly that throwing a 10% on it would cap what God has asked you to give. And God is calling you to more. In fact, I love this quote from Randy Alcorn. God blesses us to raise our standard of giving, not our standard of living. That far too often when we come into some more money, be it a raise or a new job or something like that, we think in terms of, how can I spend this? Now that there's a gap between what I used to make and what I make now, or what I used to have and what I have now, what can I do with it for me? But for many of us, God has called us or has blessed us to raise our standard of giving, not our standard of living. I heard this story, and it was people who had met at a conference, and they were all local to the area, so they were young, right at 30 years old or so, couples, and they decided to get together. And they had met at this conference, and they didn't really know much about each other's background, but they had this common event in mind. Christian people, so they got together, getting to know one another, and one of the people that were there, he was a worship minister. And so he was really interested in how this conversation would go. And as they're just talking, somebody finally broaches the subject I think he was worried about. And they said, well, how much do we think that ministers should make? And, his antenna went up. Now he's very much paying attention to what these people think. They don't know he's a minister. And so they have different thoughts on it, just like many Christians, many different churches have different thoughts on that. And he let their conversation go for a little bit. And finally he spoke up and he said, that's a great question, but here's a better question. Not just how much should a Christian make, how much should a minister make, but how much should a Christian make? Well, they said, that's a little bit more difficult. Let's just talk about, your job instead of our jobs. And so they talked about that for a little bit. And of course, naturally, the conversation went to a point that they said, God is not calling us to having low-paying jobs or high-paying jobs or whatever. That's not a great question. And they landed on a better question, which is this. It's not how much should a minister make or how much should a Christian make, but it's how much should a Christian keep? how much should a Christian keep? The biblical principle, what we read from Paul, what we see from Jesus, is that those who have more should give more. The biblical principle is that those who have more should give more. After your basic needs are met, your giving should go up. Some people have different words for this. You might could call it a graduated tithe or something like that. And this is not to say that your standard of living can't also go up. But again, that would be the wrong mindset, is to think in terms of what can be done for us rather than what is God trying to do through you. We said it earlier, but money is not good or evil. Money is not a blessing or a curse. But money is powerful, and it is often a test. That when we have money, it's a test of our faithfulness and whether or not we will continue to trust in God. So the question for many of you, you might have walked into a series like this, you might have thought, he's going to tell us and make us think about how much should we give. But I think a better question might be, how much are you willing to keep? And what does that say about your faith? Rather than thinking about how our lives can expand, we might take Paul's words to heart here. How can we be rich in good deeds, be generous, and willing to share? So just like thinking about how much to give, I bet you thought we were going to talk about our budget at some point, and I do want to talk about that for a minute. Out in the Commons, you'll find two different sheets that you can pick up. One that has just our straight, numbers, dollars and cents for next year, and there's one that's going to look a lot like this out there. And I would like everyone to pick up this page. It's right as you leave today. And what it is that it's all of what this church has been able to do this past year because of your giving. And we do a lot of things. There's a lot of ministry that has happened here because you are such a generous church. Even on that page, you're going to see that 16 people so far this past year have been baptized. And I know you don't need a church building like this or the programs we have to be baptized to come into faith, but I also believe that what we do is helping lead people to faith. And so I want you to pick that up, and I want you to celebrate what has been done through you. Now, the numbers you'll see on here are a little bit different, because sometimes when you just see it on numbers, you can misunderstand what this is for. Sometimes you see dollars and cents, but I want you to see mission and ministry. Because, for instance, everything that we spend here for our youth and children's ministries, I put under next generation right there. Because you could haggle over what we spend on this or that, but what we want out of that ministry is for the next generation to have faith. You may not participate on Wednesday nights, what we call Journey, or you may say, hey, might be a way to have it cheaper or do it better, and that may all be true. But the reason we do it is because we want the next generation to have faith. And so, we have on here, even the cost to our building and things like that. We want you to come in here and be comfortable. I know some of you are comfortable, some of you are hot, some of you are cold. Regardless, all of that costs money. Everything we do around here, there is a cost involved, but it is for the purpose of ministry. And so next year we have a big budget. It's about $1.1 million. And what the staff and the elders want you to know are a couple of things. That's the ministry that we believe that God has called us to next year. More importantly, what I want you to know is that this is a long process to put the budget together. And it is done with prayer, with wisdom, and with discernment. That our elders in particular spend a lot of time on this, praying and asking God to show them what kind of work He would have for us next year. There is an element of our budget that ties into our vision and our mission as a church. Of God, who are you calling us to be? And so we do a lot around here, and it's all for the sake of reaching those who don't know Jesus, of helping to make and grow disciples of Christ. And so this is a generous church, and with your help, we will continue to be that, and that we'll be able to love one another, love our neighbors, and love the world, and yes, through your giving. So I want you to pick up one of those as we leave this morning. But I do need to issue a challenge before we leave this series in particular. This is a generous church. Let me say that one more time. That's what I want you to mostly hear. It's a very generous church. However, like most churches, there is what I would call a giving gap here. And what I mean by that is that if you run any type of numbers, and you could use our church, you could use any church as an example, is there is a gap between the giving that happens and the potential giving that could happen. And that's just running against some numbers, depending on what percentage you want to put on it. And so what I want you to see is that when we call on you to give, it's not because we want to, make this building any nicer just for that sake, or give the staff a raise, or you're not going to hear me turn that down. But it's because what we know is that there is work to be done here. That God has, before we broke ground on this spot, that God had a plan for this church. That God had a mission for this church. God has been working in this area long before us, and He will continue to work long after us. But while we are here, He has work for us to do. And that's not just unique to our church, by the way. That's for every church. We are in this time, in this place, I believe, for a reason. And we need you to partner with us. We don't need just your giving, we also need your talent. Something like today wouldn't happen if a bunch of people didn't put these bags together, didn't do the shopping, and if a bunch of you wouldn't go deliver it today. And that's a great way to think about the work that we do here. We need all of those elements, and yes, that includes your giving. At the beginning, I said this sermon series is about giving, but it's not really about giving. Ultimately, this is about whether or not you will put your trust in Him. Whether or not you will be faithful, or whether or not you will jump on a treadmill of money and of finances that you can never get off of. What I know to be true is that if you live according to the way that God has called you to live, you will find more peace and freedom and fulfillment. That's the life that will truly bring life, as Paul said. When you take your calendar and you adopt it to a way that God would call you to live, you're going to find peace and fulfillment that you will not otherwise find. And yes, when you handle your finances as a family, including how you spend, but also how you give, if you do that how Jesus has called you to, you're going to find a peace that you will not otherwise find. As we close today, our shepherds and their wives will be around the room. And we know that many of us need to start in prayer. Because as you'll notice, again, I did not give you a percentage. That is going to be between you and God. For most of us, we probably need to increase where we are today. And so I want you to cover that in prayer. To go to God and say, God, you have blessed me with everything. What are you calling on me to give? And it can start today in prayer with one of these couples. As we close today, there is a prayer on the back of the bulletin. And I want everyone to pick up a bulletin. I want you to pray this prayer this week. And as we close, I'm going to pray this over us as we close today. If you would, please be standing. Father, we know that godliness with contentment is great gain. We bring nothing into this world and we take nothing out. We who call Jesus Lord devote ourselves to resisting greed. It can plunge the human heart into ruin and pierce it with many griefs. Father, we are determined to practice generosity with free hearts, fixing our hope on you and not the uncertainty of wealth. We desire to be rich in good deeds, willing to share all we have, laying up for ourselves treasure that will not decay, but shine in the age to come. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.